Did your family walk on eggshells or explode without warning?
I paid my parents $600 every single week for an entire year, and when I found out they left for a family vacation without me, I thought maybe it was a mistake or some last-minute oversight, but it wasn't. And the truth hit harder than anything I had ever experienced, because when I confronted my father, he looked me dead in the eyes and said the words that will never leave me. "We didn't want you there." Even as I repeat those words now, they cut through me like broken glass, because for 12 months straight I carried the weight of their mortgage, their grocery bills, even the car insurance my brother still drove under their name while never paying a dime himself. And I did all of it without hesitation, because I thought that was what family meant, that you pitch in when the people who raised you are in trouble, even if it means you spend less on yourself, skip dinners out, and work extra shifts just to keep the transfers consistent every Friday morning. I had convinced myself that the sacrifices were worth it because I wasn't just paying bills, I was investing in belonging, in love, in being part of something that had always felt fragile in my childhood but still carried the illusion of safety. The arrangement began with one quiet phone call from my mom, who sounded exhausted as she explained that things were tight and they just needed a little help until Dad's bonus came through. I had been raised on stories of how my father worked his way up through the company, always bragging about loyalty and sacrifice, so the idea that a man who lectured me about responsibility was suddenly drowning in overdue bills should have been a red flag. But instead I wired the first 600 that same evening. By the following week, my dad sent me a text with a thumbs-up emoji, his version of gratitude, and the cycle began. What stings the most isn't just the money, though that alone adds up to over $30,000 across 12 months, money I could have used to pay off my student loans or finally fix the rusted frame on my car, but the realization that none of it bought me respect. Not even the illusion of it. In fact, it almost felt like the more I gave, the less they saw me as a daughter and more as some kind of living, breathing ATM who didn't deserve acknowledgement beyond the occasional, "Thanks, sweetheart, you're keeping us afloat." When I heard from my cousin that my entire family, including my brother Mark and my younger sister Emily, had flown out to Florida for a 2-week vacation, I didn't believe it at first. I scrolled through Facebook and there it was, smiling photos of them on the beach, cocktails in hand, captions about family time and memories to last forever. My name wasn't mentioned once. I wasn't tagged, I wasn't invited, and the part of me that wanted to defend them tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was last minute, maybe the tickets were a gift, maybe they thought I was too busy with work, but when I called my dad that evening, the truth fell like a hammer. His voice carried no hesitation, no attempt to soften the blow. He simply said, "We didn't want you there." It would have been complicated. Those words replayed on a loop in my head, the cruelty sharpened by how casual he sounded, as if I were a distant acquaintance rather than the daughter who had paid their bills for an entire year. I pressed him, asking how they could do that after everything I had sacrificed, after every week I transferred money without fail, and he had the audacity to say, "That was your choice. Nobody forced you." The moment he said it, something in me cracked, not the kind of crack you repair with an apology or time, but a deeper one, the kind that rearranges how you see the people who raised you. I thought of every Friday night I skipped out on dinners with friends because I couldn't justify spending $60 on sushi when I knew 600 was about to disappear from my account. I thought about the mornings I stood in line at the gas station counting change to fill my tank, while my brother posted photos of himself in Miami Heat basketball jerseys, and my sister paraded around with a new handbag, both funded indirectly by me while they lived like carefree children under the roof I was paying to hold up. That night I sat on the floor of my apartment, staring at my bank app, scrolling back through the endless rows of transfers labeled family. Each one felt like a wound, like evidence of a loyalty that had been mocked behind my back. And in that silence, broken only by the hum of my refrigerator, I realized the brutal truth. I had been excluded not by accident, not because of timing or circumstance, but because they decided my presence wasn't worth the space on the plane. The anger was raw, but beneath it was a sharper edge of humiliation, because suddenly the sacrifices I had worn like a badge of honor felt foolish, almost laughable, as if I had been the only one who didn't see the game being played. And even though I wanted to cry, I found myself laughing instead, a bitter, shaky laugh at how stupidly loyal I had been, how desperately I wanted to believe that giving enough money could buy me the kind of love my parents had always reserved for my siblings. But what my father didn't know, what none of them knew in that moment, was that their words didn't just cut me, they ignited something else entirely. Because if they thought I would quietly keep funding their lives while being treated as disposable, they had no idea what was coming next. And as I sat there, replaying his words again and again, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. The next move would be mine, and it wouldn't be the one they expected. The morning after my father's sentence detonated whatever fragile belief I still had in the word family, I woke with the kind of hollow clarity that shows up after a storm strips the paint off a house and you finally see the rot underneath. And while my first instinct was to curl up and nurse the bruise to my pride, my second instinct, the one that lives somewhere between self-respect and a stubborn streak that has carried me through worse, told me to get up, open my laptop, and remove the invisible hoses I had allowed them to attach to my accounts, because if I was going to be called complicated, then I might as well complicate things in a way that taught everyone involved a lesson they would not forget. I pulled up my bank and killed the recurring transfer with the same decisiveness a nurse uses to rip off a bandage, feeling the smallest rush of freedom as the confirmation banner blinked at me like an exit sign, and then, because anger without structure turns into noise, I opened a spreadsheet and itemized every single weekly payment across the last 12 months, adding notes for the weeks when I covered their car insurance, the month I fronted the property tax installment, and the little extras my mother pretended were emergencies even though they were clearly conveniences, like the gas card my brother apparently needed because his commute was rough, which translated to his habit of driving to late-night games and sleeping in until noon. Once the numbers sat in tidy columns that no one could argue with, I drafted a short, surgical email titled Vacation Reimbursement Agreement, written in a tone I borrowed from the contracts at my office, calm, polite, boringly professional. Which made the content sting more, because nothing says you messed up like a daughter who has stopped pleading and started invoicing, and in the body I laid out a 3-month repayment plan with weekly installments, CCing Mark and Emily not to humiliate them, but because sunlight is the only disinfectant that actually works in a family that thrives on side conversations and selective memory, and then, because I am admittedly a little petty when the situation deserves it, I set up a standing payment request on Zelle labeled Beachfront Inclusion Fund, Installment 1, a name that made me smile even as my chest ached. For a few minutes I stared at the screen and considered whether sending it would be a bridge too far, and then I remembered my father saying no one forced me, and the memory hardened my resolve, so I hit send and watched the message fly. Imagining it landing in their inboxes while they were still unpacking sand-dusted shoes and the cheap seashell bracelets my sister always buys and forgets in her makeup bag, and as I shut the laptop I felt a steadier kind of anger settling in, less like a bonfire and more like a pilot light, small, contained, and absolutely reliable. The replies did not arrive immediately, which told me more than words would have, because in my family silence is not thoughtful, it is strategic, but social media has never met a strategy it could not ruin. And by mid-morning a cousin posted a carousel from the trip that I would have scrolled past if not for the final image, a receipt someone had snapped as a joke while they balanced a margarita in the other hand, where the line items listed the oceanfront rental deposit, the restaurant pre-authorization, the rental car upgrade, and, perched right there between them in the clearest font the printing kiosk could muster, a Venmo inflow that landed within the hour I sent my Friday transfer 2 weeks prior. Annotated by my mother with a cheerful heart that made my stomach lurch, because I recognized the memo I had typed in a moment of trust, for household. I enlarged the photo until the pixels fractured and then shrank it again, not because I doubted what I saw, but because disbelief is a stubborn muscle, and in that moment 100 little memories snapped into their proper order. My mother's sudden brightness the week they booked the flights, my father's casual comment about timing working out, my siblings' smug energy wrapped in the fake warmth of people who know a secret and enjoy hiding it in plain sight, and I realized with the coldness of Someone finally done making excuses that a portion of my transfers, perhaps more than a portion, had been redirected to bankroll the very getaway from which I had been deliberately excluded. Humor keeps me from crying when pride feels like it has been scraped with a dull spoon, so I let a thin smile curve as I opened Venmo and edited every past memo I could still change to read family vacation subsidy. Then queued a series of public payment requests for my parents in neatly spaced amounts called Inclusive Memories Installment, which was not cruel so much as accurate, and while I knew it would embarrass them, I also knew what they had hoped would never surface now had a tidy, undeniable paper trail that matched the date of my transfer to the hour of their booking, a simple arithmetic that even my father's moral lectures could not outtalk. My phone buzzed with a message from Mark that was all bravado and no punctuation, accusing me of making things dramatic and asking if I was actually charging our parents, like a landlord. And I typed back a single sentence about adults paying for what they take and hit send before I could soften it, because there is a time to be gentle and there is a time to be precise, and precision was overdue. Yet, even as I bathed in the petty satisfaction of that small revenge, something heavier pressed at the edge of my attention, a calculation about what would follow once the silence broke. The silence did break, not in a call or a text, but in a notification from my bank that arrived close to midnight, one of those automated fraud alerts that asks you to confirm whether a large transaction is legitimate. Flagging a cash advance pulled against my mother's credit line within minutes of a failed attempt to cover a hotel balance connected to the same booking reference printed on that sunny receipt, and as I sat in the dark with the glow of the screen washing my hands pale, the puzzle snapped together with almost insulting neatness, because the money I sent to keep a household afloat had been slotted into deposits and upgrades and dinner reservations, and now, with my transfers cut and their balances tapped out, the vacation that did not want me had boomeranged back into my lap in the form of their looming shortage, leaving me with a choice I had never actually had before, and as the clock turned past midnight, I knew exactly what I was going to do next, even if they would not see it coming. By the time the sun pushed a strip of weak light across my blinds and turned the room from indignant midnight to that gray morning that makes everything look like an audit sheet, I had already translated anger into action by drafting a list that was half boundary and half blueprint, because if the last year had been a slow leak of dignity disguised as generosity, then the only way forward was a controlled shutoff. So I started with the obvious and called my bank to place blocks on any external pulls tied to my information, removed every automatic payment that touched their address, and asked for account alerts that would ping me if any merchant tried to reroute charges through past authorizations, after which I logged into my credit report, dropped a full security freeze on all 3 bureaus, and added a fraud alert that would require verbal confirmation for any new account activity, not because I believed my parents were criminals, but because I finally believed my parents were careless in ways that left me carrying the bill while they told themselves they were doing their best. While the coffee went cold on the counter, I pulled every receipt and confirmation number from my email into a single folder and titled it with today's date like I was building a case file, then wrote a short, neutral letter addressed to the Homeowners Association and the utility companies I had covered in the months when we're just behind was the family chorus, explaining that I would no longer serve as payer of record, that any drafts against my accounts should be considered unauthorized, and that future correspondence should go directly to the property address, and because I know how these things fall apart when people can claim they didn't receive a notice, I printed each letter, sealed them with tape that stuck to my fingers, and scheduled certified mail pickups, pausing only long enough to slide my spare key into a padded envelope with a note that said, in the same even corporate tone I used for clients who refused to read their contracts, that given the new arrangements I would prefer all visits to be scheduled, a sentence that felt small and enormous at once. I would be lying if I said any of this felt triumphant, because each click and confirmation tugged at an old thread of loyalty that wanted to argue for patience and second chances, yet the more I itemized, the more the story straightened out. And in that clarified narrative I could finally see how many times I had translated their preference into my obligation, so I kept moving, canceling the cell family plan line that I had taken over during the winter when Mom said switching would be too complicated, porting my own number back to an individual account, and notifying the car insurance company that the policy listing me as the payer for a vehicle I did not drive would lapse at the end of the current term, after which, with a steadier hand than I expected, I emailed my father the reimbursement schedule again with a plain subject line that read confirming, added a line about beginning small claims filings if the first installment did not arrive by the end of the week, and attached the photo of the rental receipt my cousin had posted, not as a threat or a blast, but as a simple exhibit that made the math undeniable. Mark texted, predictably, with that swaggering carelessness that reads as confidence until the bill arrives, telling me I was overreacting and that I looked unhinged, sending invoices to our parents. And I wrote back one long sentence about the nature of boundaries that began as an explanation and ended as a mirror, pointing out that adults who take from other adults without consent usually prefer their benefactors to be quiet, because silence keeps the story pretty, which I would no longer do. And before he could answer, I set my phone face down and opened a new document where I drafted a simple dinner invitation for 10 days from now that required my parents' presence if they wanted to discuss any help at all. A formality that gave me the time and space to think strategically rather than emotionally, and, if they accepted, the chance to set the room in a way that did not tilt toward their version of events. It occurred to me more than once that what I was doing could be read as mean, and, perhaps, in a family that has always preferred carpeted feelings and soft edges, it was. Yet every time that thought nudged me, I saw my father's mouth forming the word wanted and felt the old heat rise, so I kept layering protections, including an email to my HR department confirming the change of address for any paper statements I had accidentally let drift to my parents' mailbox, and a short visit to my storage unit where I retrieved a few childhood diaries I suddenly remembered might be sitting on a shelf in their garage, because there is nothing quite like being called complicated to remind you to gather your things before someone decides your history is clutter. The day stretched in that strange way days do when you move from task to task in service of a single decision, and by evening the apartment had taken on the air of a war room, half legal pad and half kitchen table. When my laptop pinged with an email from my mother that used more ellipses than sentences and said she didn't understand why I was being so formal, and that of course the vacation had been planned for peace, and what did I mean about certified letters because she hadn't checked the mail yet, which might have softened me if the close of her message hadn't mentioned that the mortgage was due on Friday, and could I please do what I did last month, just until Dad sorted out a temporary hold the bank had placed after a small misunderstanding with the card at the hotel, a phrase so sanitary it squeaked, and as I read it I felt something inside me harden in the way a cooling metal finally takes its shape. I wrote back that I would be happy to talk in person, that I would not be transferring a thing unless the reimbursement plan began on schedule, and that any further charges tethered to my information would be disputed on site. Then I closed the laptop and turned on the kettle, which is when the phone vibrated across the counter, not with a text or an email, but with my mother's name lighting the screen at an hour when she pretended to be asleep, and when I answered I heard a voice I had not heard since childhood, thin and shaking at the edges as if fear was holding it together, telling me she knew I was angry and maybe I had every right to be, but something had happened that night that I needed to hear in person because it would sound worse over the phone. And although the sentence that followed was full of euphemisms I could barely understand, the one clear thing was this: they were not just embarrassed, and they were not just short on cash, they were genuinely desperate, and whatever my father had kept locked behind the cool dismissals was about to spill into the open. If I would just come over in the morning before he got back from a meeting he did not want me to know about. My mother opened the door with the sort of defeated posture that makes a person look smaller than they have any right to be, and before I could decide whether to accept the damp hug she offered or keep my hands at my sides in a gesture that would finally clearly mark where I ended and their needs began, she pulled me down the hallway with a whisper that sounded like a confession wrapped in a favor, saying she understood I was furious and maybe I should be, yet there were details about the Vacation that were not exactly a vacation in the normal sense, and if I could just sit at the kitchen table for a few minutes, she would explain why my father had insisted I not be told, which, once she said it out loud, clanged against the way I have always felt kept out of the room where the real decisions got made. On the table sat an overstuffed folder that had a logo I recognized from late-night commercials about paradise with payments, all stylized palm trees and promises, and as she pushed it toward me, she began a slow, miserable story about a presentation they had attended on the second day in Florida when a slick group handed them bottled water and a glossy packet and talked about legacy vacations in the trusted tone of people who never, under any circumstances, pay full price, and how the sales team, with surgical precision, asked questions designed to carve out insecurities like they were peeling a fruit, prompting my mother to talk about how our family had drifted and my father to nod along as if he were considering a strategic acquisition rather than a binding contract, and by the time the second free lunch arrived, they had been ushered into a smaller room where pens were already uncapped and papers were already flagged in yellow, and the gentle words were about family time and ownership, but the actual numbers in the fine print were not gentle at all. Piece by piece, she admitted that they had signed a timeshare contract with an introductory down payment that required a card my father insisted could handle it, and when that card hiccuped at the terminal, the manager with the smiling eyes helpfully suggested a split across 2 cards and a direct draft from an account that would be replenished soon. And this was the moment when my mother finally looked at me as if realizing for the first time that my weekly transfers did not come from a bottomless well, but from a person who set alarms and skipped takeout to make sure Friday money happened, because my father, apparently buoyed by years of my quiet compliance, had told the room not to worry since I handle the household support. A phrase that pulverized whatever remained of my belief that his cruelty on the phone had been a spontaneous misstep rather than the way he narrates me to strangers. The folder contained the glittering brochure, the ballooning schedule of fees, an amortization chart that might as well have been a staircase to nowhere, and, tucked between the papers like a guilty secret, a photocopy of a half-completed authorization form that bore my email in a handwriting that was not mine and a phone number that was mine, followed by an emergency contact line where my name had been written in the practiced block letters my father uses when he wants something to look official, which meant their beautiful family week by the sea had been funded by a machine constructed out of my transfers, my presumed silence, and the salesman's confidence that daughters like me never turn the table over in public. And as I turned the pages, my mother whispered that there was a cancellation period, short, confusing, and full of conditions, that was running out, and if I would just talk to the company and confirm I was supportive, they could roll everything into a manageable plan. That would, her voice actually quavered here, bring us together. I do not often use humor as a weapon, but it arrived anyway, sharp and precise, because the picture of togetherness they had purchased looked to me like a very expensive trap dressed as a sunset. And rather than respond with a speech, I simply reached for my phone and asked my mother to step aside while I took photos of each page, then opened the Notes app and wrote the words "rescind immediately" 3 times as if repetition might function like a spell, after which I called the customer service line on the back of the contract and, in my calmest professional voice, announced that I was the daughter listed as the emergency contact and the person whose financial support had been referenced by the purchasers, that I had not authorized any drafts or guarantees, and that I wanted the company to log, on a recorded line, my formal objection to the use of my information in any capacity, then requested the exact address and method required to execute a rescission under state law before the cooling-off window expired, which the representative, now very careful, read to me twice while I wrote it down as my mother watched with the expression of someone both relieved and embarrassed. I printed the rescission letter at the library down the street because my parents' printer was, in an irony too on the nose to be funny, out of ink, and I mailed it certified with return receipt and scanned the documents to my own email. Then forwarded a copy to the compliance address the representative had reluctantly provided along with a short chronology of how my financial assistance had been represented in the sales room, and when my mother finally exhaled, it hit me that I had just saved them from a commitment they could not afford and a shame they would have dressed in a story about family bonding, which should have felt like a win except for the sour aftertaste of knowing they would have marched me into the role of guarantor if I had let them. So I added one final step by filing a brief complaint with the state consumer office that would not burn them down but would put a small, bright light on the methods that had backed me into a corner in a place I had not even been invited to stand. There was a moment, in that quiet after the errands, when my mother sat across from me and lifted her hands in a gesture that mixed apology with habit, saying she knew my father had crossed lines, but that he panicked when he felt powerless and that he would calm down once he saw that I had handled it. And I answered with the longest sentence I have ever said to her about boundaries and the way love cannot be collateralized without going rancid, and I told her that if he wanted my help going forward he would sit at my table next week, on time and sober and prepared to account for every dollar, and that, until then, not 1 cent would move from me to them, which was the moment the front door opened and my father stepped in early, the humidity clinging to his collar like a stain, his gaze dropping to the folder, then to the certified mail receipt on the counter, and when our eyes met he smiled in that slow, neighborly way that men learn when they want to look harmless, and said that he hoped I had not done anything dramatic because the people he had been meeting were very interested in family loyalty, to which I smiled back with a steadiness I did not feel and said I had done something precise, not dramatic, and that if loyalty was the currency in the room he kept referencing, I had just changed the exchange rate, after which he laughed, not kindly, and said we would see about that tonight, because there was one more document I had not seen yet, and it had my name on it. By the time the evening of the dinner I had demanded finally unrolled across my block like a slow parade of lawn sprinklers and porch lights, I had set the room with a precision that owed more to courtroom strategy than to family hospitality. Because if anyone was going to walk me back into the role of silent patron it would not be for lack of evidence, so I dragged the thrifted dining table to the center of my living room, lined up a neat row of borrowed folding chairs from a neighbor who attends everything with a casserole, placed a stack of printed spreadsheets beside a small projector that splashed my tidy columns of dates and amounts onto the blank wall like a quiet indictment, and, because the point was not theatrical humiliation but an unblinking accounting, I set a pot of coffee and a plate of store cookies beside a little bell my retired notary neighbor had offered to bring if signatures became part of the evening, which they would, provided my parents wanted to walk out with anything resembling my support. When the knock came it was my mother first with the worried smile she uses like makeup, followed by my father with that careful geniality that plays well in waiting rooms and church foyers, and behind them, because I had copied them on everything, my brother and sister who had the decency to look uneasy without finding the courage to apologize, and after we sat I opened with one long sentence that laid out the ground rules in a tone even I had never heard from my own mouth, explaining that I would keep my voice calm and they would not interrupt, that I would present the simple timeline of my payments alongside the social posts and receipts that had cross-referenced those payments to vacation deposits, that I would confirm the timeshare rescission had been sent within the cooling window and that any attempt to revive it would trigger a complaint I had already drafted, and that we would then review a short 2-page agreement my neighbor would witness that included a repayment schedule, with small, manageable installments beginning this Friday, a hold harmless clause for any accounts not in my name, a boundary statement about contact and keys, and a charity clause that would redirect any missed installment to a scholarship fund at the community college in our last name, because if they chose to skip me they would still contribute to something that did not insult the word family. My father half laughed and then, as if he could not help himself, reached into his leather folder and produced the document he had promised, which turned out not to be a mortgage or a loan or anything with sharp legal teeth, but a typed page formatted like a friendly note from me authorizing the resort to speak to him on my behalf, paired with a draft email he wanted me to send admitting that I had misunderstood the presentation and had overreacted under stress. Language that a salesman had clearly given him because it read like something tested on hundreds of daughters in similar chairs, and before he finished his speech about saving face, I took the paper and, without raising my voice, slid it under the projector so the whole room could watch me draw a single line through the middle. After which I placed the rescission receipt beside it and said that any conversation with the resort would now pass through the complaint case number printed on the top of the letter, which hushed the room with the unmistakable sound of a door locking in the right direction. I did not rely on anger for the next part because anger is loud and people stop listening, so I used the steady rhythm of numbers and dates that make even stubborn men go quiet, moving through the transfers, the captions, the monthly totals, the coinciding credit alerts, the midnight bank messages, and the small mountain of texts in which I had said yes while they had said later, and when I finished I clicked the projector off so the wall turned blank and gave them the choices with a lightness that came, surprisingly, from kindness, telling them that option 1 was to sign the agreement, begin the installments, and rebuild something with me slowly and publicly so that nothing could be twisted in a hallway whisper, while option 2 was to refuse. In which case I would file a small claims action on Monday morning with my folders labeled and my neighbor's affidavit attached, and I would also forward the social posts and the receipt trail to the family group chat so the silence that had protected them would belong to me instead. My mother reached for the pen first with the graceless speed of someone grabbing a steady rail on a moving bus, and even though her eyes brimmed with something that looked like shame, her hand did not tremble as she printed her name, then slid the pen toward my father who, after a small show of indignation that fooled nobody, signed as well, and it was only then that I let the smallest slice of humor into the room by ringing the little bell and thanking my neighbor for witnessing as if we were 3 lines into a church bake sale order form, which made my brother exhale a laugh he tried to swallow, and when he muttered that I had turned into a very organized jerk, I did not rise to it. I simply handed him a printed sheet labeled Boundaries that removed his gas card from my life and suggested he call the insurance agent himself like the adult he pretended to be online. With the papers signed and the first installment already scheduled through a standing transfer that would bounce automatically to the scholarship if it missed, my mother asked in a voice that tried to sound normal whether the dinner invitation meant we were, as she put it, okay now, and I told her that okay was a place I could not map tonight, that tonight was merely a new ledger opened under a different name, and I added that forgiveness and access are not identical twins even if our family had dressed them alike for years, a distinction that made her look older for a moment before she stood to help me stack the chairs, a small domestic motion that might have been beautiful if it had not arrived a year late. After they left, I stayed in the doorway long enough to watch my father guide my mother down the steps with a careful hand usually reserved for strangers, and while I waited for the text to begin, my sister's apology shaped like a paragraph of excuses, my brother's bravado dissolving into late-night rationalizations, my father's likely attempt to renegotiate the schedule as if the ink were not dry. I set my phone on the table and placed the spare key in the drawer beside the bell, telling myself that the point of revenge is not to wound, but to reset the terms of contact, and that I had, in one evening, built a structure in which their desperation did not translate to my obligation, which should have felt like triumph but instead felt like a quiet emptiness that I could not immediately name, because as the house settled and the projector cooled and the neighbor waved through the window with the tired cheer of someone who has seen many versions of this night, my phone lit with a new message from my father that contained no words at all, just a photo of the timeshare brochure folded into a paper boat floating in their kitchen sink, a gesture that might have been contrition or it might have been performance, and as I stood there wondering which, I realized the line between those two things has always been the one my family refuses to see, so I turned off the porch light and left the door locked, then lay awake listening to the house breathe while the first installment date marched closer, unsure whether I had finally stepped out of their story or simply rewritten my part with better punctuation.